So thanks very much, everybody. So it is on. So thanks very much, everybody. And I'd like to first of all say thanks, Jonathan, for inviting me to chair this session on BRESSON on philosophy. And he wanted a philosopher to do it. There seems to be a competition around about who shouldn't be here, what person should be thrown out. I think I win this hands down. Okay, I want to put my bid in, which is, it was only this week that I saw a Bresson film. I asked Jonathan to send me some because I thought I'm going to be here. Right, so this is and it was a wonderful education. I watched 3 of them and he sent me and they were terrific. So thanks very much. And I've learned a lot. The second reason why I think I'm an interloper, the only thing that I've done on philosophy and film is on the influence of Neurath and the logical empiricists on the British documentary movement, particularly with Paul Rota. And of course, the logical empiricists in the left Vienna circle were defined very much against some of the philosophical traditions we'll be talking in the continental tradition today. But that's a really interesting debate in itself. But I'll start by introducing Robert Pippin, and I'm delighted to introduce him. I teach a course on Hegel and Marx, and in the Hegel part of that, Robert's contributions to Hegel scholarship are really important. And I'd like to thank him while we're here for those. He's also written extensively on philosophy and film. So I realized he's done everything from Westerns through Hitchcock, through film noir, and I know that he told me in an email that he's teaching a course at the moment on Bresson, and then he's working on philosophy and Bresson. So I'm really looking forward to listen to it. And over to you, Robert.
Thank you very much. I hope, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm not sure you can see me very well. It looks like I'm kind of washed out by the light there. But in any event, I seem to be appearing in some ghostly form. So that will probably be adequate. I'm very, very pleased to have been invited to discuss Bresson with a group of people who know so much more about him than I do. I'm writing a book on Bresson, and this is a very, very short précis of some of the themes of the book. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I'm also very sorry that the time difference makes it impossible for me to attend. All of the time difference and my sleep habits make it difficult for me to attend all of the sessions, but I'm going to try to listen in as much as I possibly can. Now, I'll start with some things everybody here knows very well, but I need to get on the table to talk about what I want to talk about. Over his 40-year career, Robert Bresson made 13 filmed fictional narratives that, as you all know, he claims are not even movies at all. They are instead cinematographs. He insists on this because he is dissatisfied with the fact that movies have failed to make full use of the medium-specific properties and capacities of motion picture photography and have instead rested content with being filmed theater. His contention is that such a compromise with theatrical conventions has resulted in aesthetic representations that are themselves theatrical or must inevitably be experienced as staged, not credible in the presentation of a human world, and so in some sense untrue both to what cinema can do and untrue to what should be or could be cinema's goal in itself, truth. Bresson's experiment is to show that the world on film can be both the world as it can be uniquely available to film, and yet, by virtue of the cinema's unique capacities, also present fundamental dimensions of the world as such in its truth, how it really is, in its various psychological, social, and even metaphysical dimensions. He has a great deal of confidence that a camera can disclose something true about human being that cannot be disclosed otherwise, especially in ordinary experience. This means, though, that in order to avoid the directorial mistake noted above, filmed theater, Bresson had to work to develop a style that everyone rightly describes as austere, rigorous, pure, minimalist, bare, all in a way that's also not distracting from, but also enhances the primary mode of a viewer's receptivity, our emotional responsiveness, emotional in the sense that needs a lot of unpacking. His success in this attempt would mean that we are still engaged in, deeply emotionally involved in, gripped by the filmed world, even while the film itself invites a different sort of absorbed attention, one inspired by a different sort of ambition, the highest level of aesthetic ambition, I think, again, truth. We then need to understand the distinctiveness of the cinematograph and what it could mean for such a vehicle to be the bearer of truth. So I want to say that the first step in understanding Bresson's ambition is to understand that deliberately refusing to invite conventional cinematic absorption in a movie world is motivated by more than a commitment to aesthetic concerns, to cinematic purity or medium-specific rigorousness. It has to do with a range of radical philosophical commitments. None of this means that the films are merely the vehicles for the expression of these views. The films are the views. My idea is that Bresson's ideal of cinematic absorption, and with that the idea of cinematic truth, is based on philosophical views about the nature of worldly absorption, sources of meaningfulness in a life in a historical world, or the sources of meaningfulness in a cinematic world, both for the characters in the filmed world and for the film world, are inseparable from the question of the general possibility of sources of meaningfulness in a historical world in general, in particular ours. The same inseparability is true when trying to understand the failure of meaningfulness, which appears to be Bresson's main issue from 1966 and Eleazar Balthazar on. So let me first summarize, again, just to get on the table, all those unique cinematic properties of a Bresson cinematograph, and then briefly suggest their philosophical dimensions, the dimension that in the 20th century would call to mind mostly the work of Martin Heidegger. I mean, I'm not claiming any direct influence by Heidegger. I've seen all the YouTube video interviews, and I've read all the interviews collected with Bresson in that volume, and I don't detect any clear reference. However literate and extraordinarily well read Bresson was, I'm not able to find any direct reference to Heidegger, but so much of this was in the air in the 40s and 50s in France that I would be surprised if there weren't some sort of encounter with at least Heideggerian ideas, but that's not really central to what I want to say. This is just a kind of framework for understanding what he's trying to do, not charting any intellectual inference. By far, the most well-known directorial decision was beginning with the casting of Claude Ledoux in 1955's Diary of a Country Priest to avoid professional actors and to cast unknowns as his major characters, non-professionals whom he would never use again except in one case, in other roles. His summary account of this was that these unknowns were to be understood not as actors, but as models, in the sense that one would speak of a painter using models for his work. Bresson explains his decision by expressing skepticism that film actors can succeed in doing what they're asked to do. Quote, the actor, it's not me you're seeing and hearing, but the other man. Being unable to be wholly the other, he is not that other, unquote. This is because, quote, a cinema film represents the reality of the actor at the same time as that of the man he is being, unquote. Bresson clearly believes this is impossible. It's impossible to submerge the former into the latter. We always see both the actor and the character. By contrast, what would it mean to instruct an actor not to act? Bresson's answer to this question more and more discloses the intertwining of aesthetic and philosophical commitments, just as we would expect. A view about what is necessary in order to avoid falseness in the depiction of what human-mindedness and attempts at communication involve or are really like, to attempt to avoid, as he noted, mere seeming and to depict it being as it is, must involve some determinate commitment to how it really is, what that in a simple sense looks like. And his report of his instructions to his models makes that clear. Quote, radically suppress intentions in your models, unquote. This will result in what can seem an apparent automatism in line delivery and expression. Quote, 9/10 of our movements, not just an actor's movements, obey habits and automatism. It is anti-nature to submit them to will and to thought. He believes this because they are not, for him, subject to will and to thought. He wants to achieve this because of some quite general views that would, if we had several more hours, require attention to the films to fully understand, because they are visual embodiments of these philosophical positions, summaries of which don't do them any justice. Quote, models mechanized externally, internally free. On their faces, nothing willful. The constant, the eternal, beneath the accidental, unquote. Bresson obviously does not believe that in ordinary life, people communicate with each other in what can sometimes seem an affectless, monotonic, robotic way. But he clearly does believe that on camera, the suppression of deliberate or visibly intentional expressiveness and the use of minimalist voice inflection will allow the camera to record something the human eye misses in rapid, normal interchanges, and that is psychologically disclosive. That aspects of the soul will, in essence, leak out. This is a kind of a Proustian theme in Bresson. Ordinary experience registers things on us that we're not aware that are being registered. Proust believed that involuntary memory could return us to the truth of what we actually experienced without knowing we experienced it. And Bresson believes that with these acting techniques and with the camera, that can be revealed in a different way. And in general, it's a familiar modernist strategy that Bresson, that former painter, would have been quite familiar with. Manet's Olympia or Cézanne's Bathers clearly do not aim at representational verism, but they do try to picture something about beings in a world otherwise missed in ordinary perception. Quote, on the watch for the most imperceptible, the most inward movements, unquote. Quote, make visible what without you, the cinematographer, might perhaps never have been seen, unquote. Bresson made these decisions about models and line delivery because he's clearly skeptical that a wide range of meaningful comportment with objects in the world and with others is conceptually self-conscious or at all cognitive, and suspicious as well that actions we perform are rightly understood by references to the intentions we would self-consciously avow. That is, his suspicion of movie acting reflects a suspicion that what we do is best understood by intentions we would express when asked why we are so acting. Of course, that may be true in most trivial cases, but if the situation is more complicated in critical or decisive situations, it isn't. In the simple example, Balthazar opens with a reminder of this when, in one cut, the father flatly refuses to buy the donkey for his children, and in the next scene, they're taking Balthazar home. Just to mention Balthazar, the spectacular example of this is the depiction of Marie, whose intentions don't seem to be unconscious or unknown to her. They don't seem to exist. In other words, her submission and revulsion to Gerard at the same time in that unbelievably pathetic scene where she's being manhandled by him in the car and submitting to it, but weeping at the same time. That involves quite a serious philosophical commitment to the nature of human intentionality, and it's the mistake of too ambitiously thinking that determinately minded states of mindedness are responsible for why we do what we do. The depiction of Marie throughout the film actually is a case study in why or how Bresson can make quite credible a different sort of picture that most of us in ordinary life miss. Quote, models who have become automatic, their relations with objects and persons around them will be right because they will not be thought. I think he means by right here, not just cinematically right, but true, revelatory, disclosive. I suggest that he does not mean will seem right on camera because not acted out, but because this approach avoids a superficial view of the role of self-conscious thought in our ordinary familiarity with objects and persons in the world and in our action. In turn, this implies something much broader, that at the original or primordial level of our experience, simply how things show up as salient in our world, the availability of anything to experience is first of all a matter of what he calls impressions and sensations. I think what he's getting at will require a more perspicacious language than impressions and sensations, which can suggest mere affects causally produced, which is not at all what he means. He's not pleading for behaviorism or empiricism. He's committing himself to something quite controversial in philosophy, that there is a mode of non-discursive intelligibility by virtue of which the world and others are originally familiar, meaningful. Filmed thought is felt thought, in other words, but still very much thought. This is a level of meaningfulness prior to perceptual or conceptual discriminability. Likewise, the camera must try to capture a relation between an agent and her deeds that's not limited to the conscious intentions the agent would avow. For example, he wants to deny that the effect of his directorial instructions produces inexpressiveness. Quote, involuntary expressive models, not willfully expressive ones, but involuntarily expressive. And quote, no psychology of the kind which discovers only what it can explain, unquote. Quote, when you do not know what you are doing and what you are doing is the best, that is inspiration, unquote. The terms impressions and sensations, I think, are too limited to capture what the cinematographs achieve, but what he's after is clear enough when he gives this advice about shooting a scene. Quote, stick exclusively to sensations, no intervention of intelligence which is foreign to these impressions and sensations, unquote. All again, because the intention in shooting this way is to capture how it is, not how it seems to the individuals being depicted. I want to say that this amounts to a position on the fundamental basic availability of a meaningful world of objects and others, that it is non-discursively and precognitively available, that elements of a world become originally salient to us in their meaningfulness or the way they matter to us, and that we are on to such meaning by being attuned to it in a way that parallels our unreflective absorption in a filmed world. Ultimately, this entails something much more controversial philosophically, that a filmed fictional narrative can disclose something true about the human world without such a truth being determinately statable proposition as something like an assertion. Hence the aura of mystery and elusiveness in so many of Bresson's films, another aspect of their truthfulness. Finally, while Bresson's cinematographs have continuous plots, he doesn't believe that narrative continuity is the basic way that films have the disclosive meaningfulness they have. The critic of Bresson, Jean-Louis Provoyeur, in his terrific book on Bresson and the Sublime, calls this technique de-narrativization. I think he's quite right. Quote, cinematographic film, where expression is obtained by relations of images and sounds, and not by a mimicry done with gestures and intonations of voice, one that does not analyze or explain, that recomposes, unquote. As the name implies, Bresson means to compare his method of composition to writing with images, where images are not understood as represented content so much as acquiring meaningful content in the sequence of images, as in linguistic holism, where the basic unit of meaning is not the word, but the sentence. Quote, cinematography, a new way of writing, therefore of feeling, unquote. This is to produce a, quote, cinema of montage and rhythm, unquote, one that is, quote, primarily poetry and music, the creation of new relationships between things, beings, sounds, and images, as in the succession of shots, unquote. This notion of an asyntotonic or purely paratactic structure can be taken too far. Bresson's films are not like silent films without intertitles. They are fictional narratives with plots, dialogues, beginnings, middles, and ends. The images, the individual shots, have content, and the link between the shots, that is, the comprehensibility of the sequences, do depend heavily on a continuity of sense among those contents, as well as what Bresson is emphasizing by appealing to cinematography, an atmospheric emotional coloring built from montage, the sequence itself as a source of meaning. This goes considerably beyond Lev Kuleshov's famous experiments with montage, since Bresson is assuming that these sequences of images can build to create a non-cognitive attunement to matters of significance and meaningfulness not otherwise available. Bresson's presentation of persons absorbed in and engaging with objects and others in a world is not a picture of a world that makes a kind of familiar sense to them cognitively, conceptually, or even consciously, nor of individuals who guide themselves through their lives reflectively or even thematically. What matters to them emerges and subsides pre-deliberatively and in a way that is not treated as unusual. Again, Azard Balthazar, not only is Marie not reflectively aware of her interest in and revulsion from Gerard, she sometimes barely seems determinately minded at all, resisting and submitting often at the same time in ways that challenge any conventional philosophical account of her intentions or even her acting intentionally, even though the other contrast in philosophy between acting intentionally, things done to you, does not seem the right duality to understand what's going on with Marie. And this is not treated as a matter of Marie's individual indecisiveness. The possibilities open to Marie in the world she lives in shape what kind of life and even what kind of mindedness she can have, how little of any kind of life is available to her, and so what Marie can possibly envisage. And those possibilities themselves are conflicted and contradictory, as is her own behavior, which is what it is because of that world. In A Man Escaped, there's no time spent showing the prisoner Fontaine deliberating about what he should do or explaining himself, trying to justify himself to his companions. Imprisoned in that world, his mode of being just thereby becomes escaping, all that makes sense to him. No other mode of being would. And escaping matters in an immediate way that's not a product of any reflection about what he should do, whether it's too risky, whether it's his duty, for example. And there's a great deal of screen time devoted to his patiently and in laborious detail, simply working at making what he needs to realize to happen. Single-mindedness, at that term, doesn't begin to convey the depth of his commitment. In Pickpocket, Michel seamlessly and easily simply becomes a thief. And what it means to him to be a thief, apart from believing he is exempt from any moral disapprobation, is simply to be a good one. He's even indifferent to his being caught, as in famous penultimate scenes. The way these characters understand the world around them is in terms of the projection of their own practical possibilities, something set by the horizon of meaningfulness, the worldhood of the world they live in. Extra clothing or a mattress wire show up, mean something to Fontaine as material with which to make a rope. A spoon is a potential chisel. It's not a matter of him projecting meaning on what is an inanimate object, and the object acquires its meaning within the world Fontaine finds himself thrown in. What is especially interesting about what Bresson is trying to get at non-discursively is also very important politically. Bresson makes films about well-off Parisians, and earlier in his career about poor French peasants. But even though in the latter cases, something like the liberal democratic ideals have been roughly realized, at least for, it's not feudalism, at least for the characters we see, some security, minimal prosperity, but the rule of law, bourgeois families and so forth. And while in some cases there is great misery, poverty, moral indifference, cruelty, the films detect a powerful dissatisfaction that seemed to have little to do with prosperity or poverty. Unavailable sources of meaning that one could orient oneself from and that could sustain a life, the unavailability of it is itself a form of suffering, all the more painful and frustrating because such sources of meaning, even if realized as absent, can't be willed into existence. The experience of so many of his characters of a kind of homelessness and lostness is not a pathology to be cured or a lack to be filled by some action. And this often leads to a distinctly modern form of despair in the later films. And Bresson is clearly interested in the sources of the thinned out availability of meaningfulness in the world in which these characters are thrown, and more after the mid-60s. The emphasis on technological modernization and consumerist capitalism begins in Oazard Balthazar with the transition from donkey carts to automobiles, plows to tractors, and the new world of transistor radios, motorbikes, jukeboxes. And it continues through another village in transition, Mouchette, with its soundtrack of trucks rumbling by on the new highway that will change every aspect of what had been daily life in the village, to the later films in which youth despair reaches the level of the suicidal. With a little more time, I would want also to explore the connection between the suppression of expressiveness and intention in the actors and the way that allows what I think Bresson, to speak kind of simplistically, is actually trying to film, which is the world itself, the world understood as a horizon of meaningfulness, that not something that can be an object in the world. The suppression of this notion of a psychological set of beliefs or attitudes or desires allows the film to capture the way in which, as I was trying to say a little bit about Marie, the way in which this horizon of meaningfulness works itself through the characters in a way that isn't a matter of the characters agreeing or accepting or rejecting, that there's a quite different relationship between the sources of available significance in a world and the characters than a psychological one. And that, I think, is a magnificent achievement of the films and discloses something that is generally unavailable to philosophy as it's sort of academically understood. But I think I've exhausted my time, so I should stop. But thank you for this chance.
Right, thanks very much, Robert. That was terrific. So I'll now introduce Carl Pletink. Yeah, got it right. Who's holds a degree in Doctor of Literary Studies at the University of Antwerp. He studied philosophy as well as film and theatre and literary studies. And he's interested in the entanglement of French film aesthetics with continental philosophy and politics. And currently he's preparing a research project on the political theology in French post-made 1968 films, aesthetics and culture. But looking forward to your talk, so thanks very much.
Thank you. One thing to say before I start, the title of my presentation has changed a bit. And while writing it over the last 2 weeks, I lost transcendence on the road. But the presentation ties in well with the theme of despair that Robert Pippin mentioned at the end of his lecture. Now, okay. The image on the left is a screenshot from Fassbinder's film, Die Dritte Generation, a film on left-wing terrorism, in the opening sequence of which Bresson's Le Diable Probablement is a major role. And what we see exactly is the final sequence in which the protagonist, Charles, suicides himself or is killed. It's a bit, which is not a spoiler because the film begins with this information. Now, Fassbinder was extremely impressed by Bresson's film precisely because he said it rejects every commitment. Now, this pessimism is key to his film, Die Dritte Generation. Now, still, I believe that there is something peculiar about Fassbinder's appropriation of Bresson's film, since Fassbinder by no means shares Bresson's religious worldview. Now, I believe that in more or less all of Bresson's other films, Le Diable Probablement is a passion story. We follow an innocent child, Charles, who is driven to suicide by the ills of the modern world. Bresson covers in this film, among other things, the exploitation of nature, nuclear threat, and more in general, as a result of this, the destitution of youth in post-May 68 France. Now, Bresson said that because of the fact that these things are tolerated for the sake of money alone, he felt for the first time the need to express revolt with regard to the present. And this is a part of a 1977 interview on the film. Now, as Brian Price rightfully noted, the political content of this film is also evident in the location of Charles' suicide, namely the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris. This place is haunted by the memory of the Paris Commune. In 1871, after the defeat of the Commune, hundreds of communards were executed precisely at this cemetery. Now, it's important to note that this link between Père Lachaise and the Paris Commune is something like common knowledge in France. And maybe even more important is that in the late 1970s, several filmmakers took up this reference. So it seems that Père Lachaise had become, in the late 1970s, a kind of symbol for the failure of the May uprisings. Now, the question that I would like to ask is how to understand that Bresson sacrifices his innocent child, Charles, on such a politically loaded place. In more general terms, I would like to examine the politics of Bresson's late work a bit in relation to religion. To answer this, I will briefly expose the political background of late 1970s France, and then I will turn to a particular French intellectual history of the alignment of politics and religion, in which Bresson, at least that is a contention of this presentation, partakes. Now, despite the fact that leftist thinking thrived after May 68, the 1970s are marked by the failure of the left to gain power. A major event in this respect was the formation of the so-called Union of the Left, that is a union of socialists and communists, in 1972. Now, hopes were high for this union to win the election, but in 1974 they failed. Around the same period, there were also extremely tense debates on the totalitarian nature of communism. A genuine fear emerged that with the communists in the Union of the Left, a kind of Trojan horse was brought or could be brought into government. Michael Scott Christopherson writes that this fear, and I quote, reached new heights in 1977, when it appeared likely that the left would win the 1978 legislative elections. Now, in response, a broad anti-communist movement emerged in France, which may have contributed to the disintegration of the Union of the Left and the defeat of left-wing parties at precisely those 1978 elections. Now, I believe that this is the political background of Bresson's Le Diable Probablement. I mentioned the film's reference to the Paris Commune, which understood within this context might not only point to the disenchantment with the ideals of May 68, but also to the betrayal of genuine libertarian values by state-centered totalitarian communist parties. In an interview on Le Diable Probablement, Bresson expressed precisely his sympathy for what he calls le tutoiement magnifique né de mai 68. That is the informal address. In French, there is a distinction between tu and vous. Tu is informal, vous is formal. Which was born, he said, at May 68. Now, Bresson considers precisely this to be a sign of an unseen sense of equality among young people, a kind of a hopeful note in this context. Now, what Bresson does here is that he adheres to the egalitarian principle of informal address, which has in France a long revolutionary history. At the time of the Paris Commune, it was established, and just after the French Revolution, it was established by law. People were, they could not use vous anymore. They were forced to use the informal tu as a kind of revolutionary change of society. Now, in Le Diable Probablement, all the young protagonists, they use this informal tu. and this in contrast with the character of the bookseller, who is the bad guy of this film, who in spite of his nihilist and also revolutionary views, sticks with the formal VOO. Now, what the film shows at a certain part in certain scenes is that Charles and his friends, they feel alienated from this anarchist and revolutionary discourse to which they are, for instance, exposed at a political meeting with which the film begins. So somebody says, "I proclaim destruction," and then Charles is the character on the right who sees no point in this destruction. Now, this meeting is also depicted as exactly the opposite of a libertarian community where one could exchange ideas as equals. And furthermore, the protagonist, Charles, is extremely critical of the distribution of blasphemous pamphlets by the bookseller and his allies. What we see on the left is Charles, who comes to this bookseller and says, "Here, take your pamphlets." And on one of the pamphlets, we can read, "God is a traitor." Nevertheless, although he's against this nihilist bookseller, he also voices a nihilist view in a later scene. That is the idea of the rejection of all politics. Now, what I want to say is that Bresson, on the one hand, endorses a revolutionary idea of absolute equality, and on the other, distances himself from a certain nihilistic yet equally revolutionary leftist discourse. This is another scene where the psychiatrist asks, "Are you part of left-wing groups?" And he says yes, and then he says no. He's kind of ringing with this, yes. Now, significant in this context, I believe, is that in 1978 and 1979, Bresson signed two manifestos, the manifestos of Ciel, which was a committee of intellectuals for the Europe of Liberties, would be the translation. Now, as the title of the first manifesto suggests, Ciel should be situated within the growing aversion to a totalitarian Soviet Union-like communism. Instead, these manifestos defend pluralism, and they do so by opposing two notions. On the one hand, they speak of culture, which is equated with freedom. On the other hand, there is politics, which is equated with power. These manifestos point to the need to curtail the space for politics, that is the state, in order to guarantee the freedom of culture, which is believed to be made up of free individuals. Now, what is at stake here seems to be a clash between precisely socialism and liberalism. And this liberalist inclination of Ciel, which was mentioned, for instance, by the French daily newspaper Le Monde, became over the years, in the early 1980s, increasingly explicit. Now, what is important, I believe, is that Bresson, although he signed the first and the second manifesto, did not sign any of the manifestos after 1979. And we are left to guess why. Now, I believe that in order to better understand Bresson's politics in these late films, we should delve somewhat deeper into the worldview they espouse. Now, this worldview was obviously anti-totalitarian, and that's why Bresson could align himself with Ciel. At the same time, Ciel's liberalist tendency is completely at odds with the politics of Bresson's late films. For instance, a major concern of L'Argent is in no ways the totalitarian nature of communism, as it was so much debated in France at the time, but Bresson focuses instead on the diabolical nature of capitalism. Now, as I've said earlier, Bresson stated in 1977 that with Le Diable Probablement, he felt for the first time the need to express revolt. Bresson said that people, and I quote, are becoming more and more materialistic. They are all interested in money only. Money is becoming their god. Some years later, in an interview on L'Argent, Bresson lingers on the phrase, "Ô argent, Dieu visible," "Oh money, a visible god," a phrase uttered in the film, and he says, Money is an abominable idol. It is everywhere. Now, clearly, these films, Le Diable Probablement and L'Argent, focus on a critique of money. This critique is, I believe, as socialist as that it recalls the Gospels. Bresson points to the alienation brought about by money, but he also conceives of money as a diabolical principle, as a malevolent false deity that seems to rule the world. Now, this view is by no means the product of Bresson's mind alone. He undoubtedly was inspired by Russian novelists such as Tolstoy in L'Argent and Dostoevsky in Le Diable Probablement and a lot of his other films. Yet I believe that closer to home, there was an intellectual tradition that conveys this idea in terms even more narrowly aligned with Bresson's political metaphysical worldview. This is this intellectual history to which I believe Bresson is a part. Now, the most prominent figure of this tradition with regard to Bresson is doubtlessly Georges Bernanos, of whom he adapted 2 novels, but who also wrote lots of political texts, books on politics, contemporary politics at the time that he wrote them. And in those works, he denounces, for instance, the dictatorship of money. Now, also Bresson's writings are only a small part of a much broader revolutionary Catholic tradition in France. More specifically, I believe, this tradition concerns the legacy of Charles Péguy in the very influential journal Esprit. Now, Péguy was a highly unorthodox French writer known for his idiosyncratic blending of Catholicism and socialism. And in his work, this blending was made possible by his underlying anti-modern critique of capitalism. And Péguy is also an interesting figure in this respect because as a young guy, he was a radical socialist, very critical of the church. Then he converted to Catholicism, but he did not dismiss of his earlier socialism. And there emerged a kind of fascinating ensemble of both. Now, in the 1930s, Esprit's founding father, Emmanuel Mounier, wrote an influential book in which he exposes Péguy's critique of the reign of money. And in this book, he writes that for the first time in the history of the world, all the spiritual powers and all the other material powers together have been suppressed by a single material power, which is the power of money. For the first time, money reigns alone in the face of all other matters, in the face of the spirit, in the face of God. This discourse, which became a key element of Esprit from the early 1930s onwards, has influenced many authors close to Bresson. It constitutes the core, I believe, of a very particular French revolutionary Catholic tradition. In the 1970s, the period I was talking about before, the period when Le Diable Probablement was released, this discourse resurfaces with much vigor. The journal Esprit, which played a key role in the aforementioned anti-totalitarian movement, instigating debates and also organizing a few conferences on this theme, this journal Esprit referred to Péguy as the best antidote to totalitarianism. Even more important is that in 1975, Jean Baster, a writer already active at Esprit for a long time, not only published an article in which he exposes his long-standing and close friendship with Bresson, but also a monograph. And this monograph was called Péguy, l'insurgé. Baster's book presents Péguy as with explicit reference to the political climate at the time, as an anti-totalitarian thinker. Péguy was someone who railed against Marxist totalitarianism, against capitalism, and also against the French church, precisely for having turned itself away from socialism. The key problem for these often highly unorthodox Christians, and I think of Péguy, of Baster, of Mounier, and also of Bresson, is that in the profit-driven modern world, money has contaminated even Christianity. This view of the modern world as a capitalist bourgeois world of money in which all spiritual values are sacrificed for mere profit, even by the church, corresponds entirely with Bresson's worldview in his last two films. So after having sketched a bit the political background and this intellectual history, I only have a few remarks to conclude. If I speak of Bresson's radical politics, as Brian Price has done before me, this is so because Bresson demands a complete overthrow of the current regime. Nevertheless, his view cannot be simply called socialist, in that Bresson would convey the views of the French Socialist Party, nor of the Communist Party for that matter. His films are marked by disenchantment with left-wing politics, as we see in Le Diable Probablement. Yet also, Bresson also resists a shift to liberalism of a certain part of the French intelligentsia in the late 1970s. Although he was tempted, we could say, for a time and in this period by Ciel's combat against the Communist Party. Now, instead, I believe that in these films, Bresson seems to tie in with a particular kind of libertarian socialism, even with some anarchistic touches, we could say, as it was espoused by Péguy and as it has flourished throughout the 20th century. That Bresson could reconcile such socialism with his Catholic faith is because within this revolutionary Catholic tradition, both aspects, Catholicism and socialism, merge in their opposition to what Bresson called money, debt, visible God. Then let's turn back to the final sequence. Here we see Charles, the innocent child on the Père Lachaise cemetery, who after he's been killed, but he asked a friend to kill him because he wanted to commit suicide. Then this friend takes the money from his pocket, runs away, and the film is finished. So, thank you.
Right, many thanks, Carol. So we'll send it out straight out into the audience. So I've got one over here. We've got a lot to talk about there, so thanks very much.
I guess I had three comments. The first is that I was fortunate to sit in on a class by P. Adam Sidney in the early 80s, where he connected Heidegger to Bresson quite explicitly. And the aesthetic way in which he does that is exactly using all the techniques of notes on cinematography. The second issue is, I was wondering whether you have made any interrogation of Vincent Amiel's work on Bresson and the relation between that and automatism. And the third question was, there's a lot, I've often thought, there are a lot of connections between how Bresson used his models and how Wiseman films his films for very similar reasons. And I was wondering if you had thought of Wiseman in the context of Notes on Cinematography, a point which I once made to Wiseman and which he was intrigued enough to get a copy of Notes on Cinematography, which I gave him.
I assume that's for me. Well, no, I don't know the Amiel, so I'm very grateful for the tip.
You can't hear you. You can hear you now.
I'm sorry, is everything all right? Can you hear me technically?
Yeah, now we can.
Okay.
We can now, yeah.
The Wiseman thing I hadn't thought of. That's extremely interesting. Could you say a little bit more about what you think he's doing that? I mean, automatism is an independent topic in itself. Right? It's a somewhat misleading term. I mean, it's very frequently used by Bresson himself. It suggests something like something virtually inhuman and robotic, mechanical, and so forth. I think it's a cinematic technique that's meant to express something that we don't actually see in the ordinary world. People don't behave automatistically. But I do think it allows us this sort of depsychologization of the representation of human-mindedness, which is a somewhat paradoxical notion, to appreciate something we wouldn't see in ordinary life, where so much of human expressiveness is, in some sort of sense, strategically staged for effect, especially in dramatic and uncertain situations. But I'm really intrigued by the idea of Weissman. Could you say a little bit more about why you would think his cinematic technique and Bresson's have a similar kind of, perhaps something like philosophical implication for the presentation of what it is to be a minded human?
One of the significant features of Weissman's films is to show people in bureaucracy, in an institution, figuring out how the institution, qua institution, should respond to human interests, human demands, human needs. So there's this interplay between the abstract institution, the humans who work to serve what they interpret as the role of the institution, and the humans who are in need of what the institution is supposed to supply. So that nexus of human need and human responsibility is played out by bureaucrats who are often well-meaning, but sort of ignorant about things other than what their responsibilities are or capabilities are.
I see.
So that strikes me as something that summarizes quite a lot of what goes on in Bresson's films. We have humans who are in need of something, and they know they need it, but they can't actually get at it without some other source, either spiritual or fraternal or by chance. And that dynamic that is something that underlies a lot of existence is something I think you see that's common to life in a bureaucracy and life in a Bresson film.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. I mean, the one comment that comes to mind, also with respect to the last paper, which I enjoyed very much, very illuminating, it is whether Bresson has in mind, in the way he, not apart from his personal political commitments and what he thinks ought to be done in France and Europe in the 70s and 80s, especially, whether Bresson in the depiction of the sort of existential dilemma that the characters in, especially the post-66 films, face, whether he thinks what he's pointing to is a kind of political reformism. I think his position is, maybe this is too strong a way of putting it, but considerably more hopeless. The source, what people in Weissman's films, let's say, and Bresson share is a kind of aspiration for a source of meaningfulness that isn't available in the worlds that they live in. That's all been reduced, you could say, to a minimal level of money or power or subjective self-satisfaction or something like that. And I think the unavailability of whatever it is that has destroyed or limited or restricted the sources of meaningfulness for for Mouchette, for Marie, for Charles, for Yves and Argent, is not available to political reform in a way that's presented, at least in the films, which is completely independent of his. So getting the administrators to do something or something like that is not, it won't solve anything, because the general context of meaningfulness in late modernity has been so restricted, so reduced, that what we see in the characters is a kind of acting out of the minimal resources for a kind of purposive directedness in life. So I think the films, this also has to do with his relation to religiosity, because one aspect of the emphasis on grace is mere contingency, mere chance, sort of sub-Jansenist theme in a secular way. But that's a much larger kind of issue. But I'm grateful for the two references. I'll look at both of them.
Great. I just wanted to say a quick comment. First of all, thank you both for really wonderful presentations. Robert, I just wanted to mention, I think that the idea of automatism also takes us back to the surrealists. And as Tony Penrose pointed us to this morning, the Dada is the rejection of World War I. In 1925 or 26, Breton, puts out his first book on surrealism and defines the word automatism as a rejection of rationality. And Breton, along with Robert Desnos and René Crevel, engaged in what they call les sommeils éveillés, sleeping fits, right? Trying to bypass reason to get at something other. And for me, because I've written about it a little bit, Bresson is directly going back to this. And another word that he often uses in his interviews, but also in the notes on the cinematograph, is the word scandal. And of course, the Dadaists and the Surrealists were all about scandal making.
Yeah. God, that's a really interesting thought. I'll go back to that. I mean, one thing that occurs to me about automatism, though, is it's connected with this sort of a suspicion of our reliance on conventional psychological explanation, and that does suggest something like irrationality, because we tend to think that actions can be rationalized by understanding the conscious motives and intentions of the people who decide to execute the action. And the denial of that seems to invite the idea that people are in effect, the victims of, or the subjected to impulses, or because of the surrealist notion of there being kind of hidden sources of intentional meaningfulness that emerge when a painting, for example, can evoke something that you wouldn't expect conscious attention to the painting to evoke. The position in Bresson is so interesting because it's so radical. I don't believe he thinks these characters are motivated by unconscious intentions. That's still a formula of conventional psychology. It's just that the intentions motivating the actions are not available to the subjects, but they play the same role. I believe the world depicted in the films is such that it's not just that they don't have access to their own intentions, but or that the intentions are there, but operating causally or in some other non-rational way. I think he thinks the characters are so restricted in being able to know their own minds, or even to have formulated consciously or unconsciously the intentions they have, that the picture of human being is historically distinctive and unique, that people who have to live in this world end up like Gerard or like Marie or like Charles or like Eve. And so while I see the connection to automatism, but certainly they share this suspicion of the rationalizing psychology of traditional post-Cartesian conceptions of the mental. What's so intriguing is that the situation seems so much more radical in Bresson, as radical as the cinematic techniques.
Carol, do you want to say?
Yes, I wanted to say that I also think that surrealism plays a very important role on a theoretical level for Bresson's notes on the cinematograph. Surrealism and symbolism, I would say, for the idea of the combinations of images that produces something which is not contained in the images. It's a theory that we find, for instance, in the work of Mallarmé. But the question would be, what is the link between surrealism and Heidegger? What could be a possible kind of a common ground? And I think here we should speak of German Romanticism. And in this respect, for instance, for surrealism, Paul Éluard, he published a very beautiful book, Donner à voir, in 37, maybe a bit earlier, I don't know exactly, 31 maybe. And in this book, there is an essay of Éluard, but it's actually not an essay, it's a collection of quotes. And these quotes contain the Surrealists, but also Mallarmé, Baudelaire, and it goes back to German Romanticism. There is, besides for the French context, there is also Nerval, but he quotes, for instance, Schelling is there. And then we have Schelling's theory of art as a kind of revelation of what he calls bewusstlos and not unconscious. So there is this distinction, which is, of course, a very important influence on Heidegger's understanding of art, Heidegger's revelationist understanding of art. So the connection, why we find revelationism in Heidegger and in in French aesthetics in the first half of the 20th century, which so much influenced French film aesthetics after the war, is because they share this common ground. And this is, of course, from an intellectual history perspective. But then I would say the problem with Heidegger in the context of Bresson would be that precisely in Bresson, we will always find this distinction between reality and something that transcends this. So it's the classical opposition with Heidegger so much criticized as being metaphysics, and which Heidegger wanted to transcend, to overcome with his philosophy, which is revelationist in nature, but does something differently. And this different aspect, I do not see it in the work of Bresson.
Well, if I could respond to that, this would be a much longer conversation, but I don't see. I mean, well, 2 points. One is the surrealist connection is very important, as is the general suspicion of reflective rationality, which touches on a number of traditions from German Romanticism on. But what I find so interesting in Bresson is this emphasis on the worldliness setting, the contextual historical setting, which isn't a sort of general psychological view about rationality and irrationality, but these characters are stuck in a particular historical world that Bresson focuses an enormous amount of attention on. And so the kind of worldhood of the world issue in the Heideggerian lexicon seems to me especially, but even Diary of a Country Priest, the context of the village and the relation of religion to that village and the frustrations of the priest in trying to actually genuinely introduce a kind of religious role for the church. All of that has to do, I think, with a much more self-consciously historicist setting, which isn't as powerful a theme in Romanticism and surrealism. The other is a much more controversial claim, but I think Schrader's initial, and Susan Sontag and those people that first sort of introduced us to Bresson as a filmmaker of transcendence and religiosity, sent the reception of, and Bazin's first review of Diary of a Country Priest, the Catholics at the Cahiers du Cinéma, who were so influential in promoting Bresson, gave us a very false picture of Bresson and sent the reception of Bresson off in the wrong direction. He calls himself an atheist Catholic. That's a kind of joke, but I don't see, well, especially in the later films, any hope for any kind of transcendence. I don't see the theme of grace. I don't see the theme of religiosity at all. He makes very few films about religiously committed people: Angels of Sin, Diary of a Country Priest, Trial of Joan of Arc, and then these magnificent works of genius that have, I think, very little to do or anything to do with either religion or transcendence. But I gather that's a very controversial topic, but I agree that they're Heideggerian in their rejection of transcendence.
Yeah, one small comment to your name was Carol. I don't know. I just came to my mind that because you mentioned Fassbinder, and I just remember the end of this film, The Law of the Strongest. I don't know if that's the name in German. The German original name is Faustrecht der Freiheit from Fassbinder, but it ends in a really similar way than Le Diable Probablement. I don't know if you remember, with the guy just death in the metro and the kids stealing their money. So
I think I've seen this film.
No? So you remember? No? Anyone remembers that end? The law, I mean, it's this Faustrecht der Freiheit from Fassbinder from 1975. Well, it ends in a really similar way to Le Diable Probablement. and it's also about the money, and maybe that's why, I don't know, this relationship that you mentioned just came to my mind. But my main question was with to Robert Pippin, because you were, maybe because my English is not perfect, I don't know if I took the whole link, but you mentioned Heidegger and you mentioned the notion of truth, and I was wondering how, because I was wondering whether, while I was doing my paper from this conference, the concept, how will fit this concept that Heidegger mentioned of truth as aletheia, as unveiling, to Bresson's itself notion of truth, because he makes a difference between truth and reality, and this notion of truth sound a little bit like this kind of a reality that is at the same time unveiling and hiding at the same time. So this kind of model that it tells you something, but at the same time it hides what it's saying. So, and this relationship, this dialectics between earth and world in Heidegger also. So it's not a thing that I develop, but it's something that is in my mind. I don't know if you have think about this notion of truth, or which notion of truth are we using here? That's why I'm struggling.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's also a massive question. The reason film philosophy, that is, philosophers who think that film can have a bearing on and even be a form of philosophy, is an extraordinarily marginal area of both Anglophone and European philosophy, is that philosophers tend to think truth is only available in one way, and that is in truth bearers, that is propositions, that is assertions that assert propositions. So the traditional criticism of Heidegger, and this would be true of my own claims about Bresson's ability to disclose something true about human existence, even if historically located, is that films and novels and poems don't assert anything. And because they don't assert anything, a claim that Bresson has disclosed something true has to be distinguishable from the possibility that it's false, that he's presenting us a false. This goes all the way back to Plato, worried about what the poets can convince us of. But I again, enormously complicated topic. I'm not sure I can give you a brief answer to it, but I agree with your original intuition that there's something about truth not as the property of an assertion, but as something disclosed, revealed. Aletheia means a kind of uncovering in Heidegger. So when that is the claim being made, the suspicion that we're not going to be able to distinguish a claim that this particular film reveals something true about the way we live now, where that truth is not a proposition that asserts something that can be said to correspond to reality. If the question is a question about meaningfulness, that is how characters interpret their own lives in a way that makes sense to them or fails to make sense to them, we're not going to have available empirical propositions that can be, confirmed by reality or something like that. The whole notion of disclosure and meaningfulness puts us in an entirely different dimension philosophically, one that traditional philosophy is not prepared to address, because it needs the traditional formulation of propositional truth in order to reassure itself. But we can't hold questions of whether this makes sense to us to standards of verification. Again, this is not an adequate answer, but I'm trying to agree with your sense that there's something that should be said about the unique capacity of cinema and literature to disclose something that can't be formulated in a kind of propositional formulation, but which nevertheless we need to understand. It's a conception of film and literature as hermeneutic, and as the conditions of the credibility of the claims about meaningfulness within a hermeneutic framework, being of the sort that just by nature are not subject to the demand for verifiability. That's just the human condition. That's all we've got. And works of imaginative genius like Bresson's have a kind of power that can be convincing in a way that we don't have to worry about its sort of trustworthiness in setting policy or anything like that. It's not that kind of truthfulness. but there's a kind of powerful revelatory function in cinematic experience, without which we'd be missing a great deal in trying to understand ourselves.
Okay, I've got four questioners and 5 minutes. So if everyone can be very brief, I think what I'll do is I'll take two of them together, do it like that. So if you can do a brief comment and then ask that.
Yeah, I'll just be brief. You said that you quoted Bresson when he says, "When you don't know what you're doing and what you're doing is the best, that is true inspiration." And that sort of reminds me of his reason for stripping away the acting is to get at the truth of the underlying reality. And this reminds me of the Heideggerian flow state. And I'm wondering why it is that you reject the notion that it's Heideggerian. You know, it's not Heideggerian, Bresson's films, because this seems to sort of match up with his attempt to get at that flow state that Heidegger talked about, where they're in tune with being. And transcendence. I'm a bit out of my depth here when you said that the reason is that Bresson he doesn't deal with transcendence, but is transcendence from Cartesian? Is that surely from one mind to the body? Is Heidegger not the whole background, the background of being, and thus it's all one? It's not transcendent because it's all there. Is that, and therefore Bresson, you know, he could squeeze into that Heideggerian. Sorry to bring Heidegger back to it, but I've just.
A question for Robert mainly. Can I be a sort of devil's advocate here? What if I said that film is not an essay but a drama, and that the experience of film is between the audience and the film, and that if you draw all the experience out of your model, the audience will simply put the emotion back in, and it's all about, and this is a devil's advocate question, and it's all about understatement. It's the Hemingway thing. You take all the adjectives out of the novel, and then the reader puts all the adjectives back in. So, which takes, I know it's a kind of different angle, but I just want to ask that question, see how you respond.
Yeah. Well, again, I'll try to be very brief too. I mean, in order to answer the first question, there is something that resonates with more in Heidegger and in Bresson with empirical accessibility and the normal kind of empirical conception of the primary availability of meaningful encounter with the world as perceptual and conceptual. So there is an element that isn't, let's say, ordinary in the Heideggerian conception of how we are onto meaningfulness in life. I don't think that leads us to transcendence, but the fundamental question in Heidegger is very much not an ordinary question, the meaning of being. But by the meaning of being, I don't think he means what a being is. I think he means its meaningfulness, its significance, the way in which mattering and salience are the primary modes in which our interactions with the world make sense to us. But that's not ordinary. But it's just not. It doesn't have anything to do with transcendence either, I don't think. Well, yeah. Proust said once that a novel with ideas in it is like a living room with objects in it that still have the price tags on. And I was accused once in a lecture on Proust in Southampton of putting the price tags back on, sort of missing the point of literature. Yeah, but I think the real thrust of your question has to do with what literary criticism is. It's not meant to replace the experience of the viewer or explain it in a way in which it's negligible. Really good literary criticism is a way of reminding the viewer of what they experienced. It's a way of recreating the experience of the film. In the same way that if you're teaching poetry to a class, you don't tell them the meaning of the poem. You have to help them work out getting into the poem in the way in which they come to the meaning. And if the literary or film criticism is good, what you're trying to do is recreate an experience they had but may not have understood in the same kind of Proustian way I mentioned before.
your mention of absorption and theatricality made me think about Michael Fried and his writing about minimal sculpture. And so I'm wondering to what extent you think there's something analogous going on with the way in which people understand what's going on of interpreting Bresson and these minimalist works.
Should I answer, or should I wait for another question?
Oh, we've just given another 10 minutes, so bye, Jonathan. So you can talk for ages.
That's right. Yeah, that's kind of intimidating. Yeah, that's a terrific question. It goes to a comment that somebody made earlier about minimalism, and Bresson's films are called minimalist, but the difference between I think for Fried and for me, the difference between the uses of minimalism in that phrase is absolutely crucial. In Judd and the 60s kind of minimalist movement, the idea was to make the kind of experiential setting the actual object of aesthetic appreciation, so that the object was there, let me put it very simply, for you. That is to say, it was the occasion for you, and stripping away all of the kind of indications of meaning, black boxes and steel cubes and things like that, were meant within the gallery space as a whole to provoke whatever for you the object and the experience meant. And I think Bresson, in his anti-theatricality, is basically on Fried's side against that version of minimalism. And the easiest way to put this is by saying Bresson does not think the films are there for you. You are there for it, for the film. In other words, the film makes a complicated, coherent demand on you for a proper kind of attentiveness to the film. The film is not there as an occasion for you. And minimalism, the objection Fried had to minimalism is it's really the death of art. It's a rejection, it's anti-art, because the kind of absorption we need in the work is a response to the challenge the work makes to us. And I think Bresson is on that side of the argument about minimalism, even though the technique is spare and reduces an enormous amount of noise in the film to get to something essential. There's something essential, which is not true of minimalism. They don't want content. Lies in Sontag's against interpretation.
So this is a question, I think, primarily for Robert again, although maybe, Carol, you can speak to it, sort of political implications. Just kind of granted this sort of disclosive truthfulness, what we want to call it, in Bresson, do we want to say that there's absolutely no room for an understanding of the films which involves our sort of ordinary self-conscious intentionality? I mean, we had a paper this morning that I don't know if you heard, but about Mouchette, and we were looking at the moment when she's forced to sing by the teacher, and so the question of whether she sings the last note wrong on purpose. Now, we don't need to come down to the question of yes, she does, or no, she doesn't, but don't we need an account of her self-conscious intentionality to understand that, or would that be to misunderstand the films? Yeah. I
mean, that's the question that opens up very interesting line of thought. I mean, I think she sings the last note deliberately wrong, but intention implies she knows why she's doing it. That's, I'm going to do something for this reason. So even intuitively provoked actions, when someone can sense, as when she sings it again after she's been raped, or before she's been raped, people can do things deliberately. That is to say, they know they're doing them. But the range of things they're aware of or that they have available to them in understanding why they're doing what they're doing, which is what an intention is supposed to be, are quite limited in Bresson. I don't think she understands herself or the nature of the rebellion she's engaged in, except for the fact that she's dissatisfied with the way she's being treated, even though she knows perfectly well how to sing properly. It's really the same way that a director can, in an intuitive sense, say, no, look that way. And it changes the whole meaning of the scene. that he does that intentionally. But if you ask him, what were you trying to do? He said, well, it just seemed right. And so much bigger topic, but you can act in a deliberate way without having access to a kind of fully formed, determinate intention.
Carol, did you want to come in as well on that?
I didn't.
Okay, don't worry if you. Can I just try and put the two papers in conversations with each other a little bit, because I was really taken by the critique of money, and I saw three films, and two of them, The Pickpocket and L'Argent, seemed to have that money and the movement of money was central to it. And I just wondered, putting them in conversation, you mentioned briefly, Robert, about the role of money in a loss of meaning. And I just wondered if I could put the two papers in conversation with each other a little bit about the critique of money and whether that's related to some of the claims you wanted to make as well, Robert.
Well, yeah, in my case, I found that all Carl's account quite interesting. Bresson is quite interested in that, but I don't think it's a materialist claim that connects easily with neo-Marxist politics. I think he thinks the circulation of meaning as the circulation of money and its connection with power is part of this larger framework of available sources of meaningfulness. It's not so much that what's wrong is, or what really is disruptive in a society is that a small group of people have a great deal of the excess or surplus capital that's produced, and they have, by virtue of that, an enormous amount of power to direct the course of other people's lives. That's certainly very wrong and, unjust, and there's a lot of things to be said about that. But what Bresson is interested in is the enormously complicated implications of a society in which so much of all kinds of meaningful engagements in human life, like love or romantic relationships or ambition and so forth, are all centered around a society in which the available sources of meaning are tied to money. It doesn't necessarily need to a political solution, but so I was quite interested in Carol's account of the actual political activity of Bresson and how much he thinks it's connected with the actual making of the film. Certainly in The Devil, probably in L'Argent, it looks like it's a reflection of his political views, but I wonder if he thinks Carol thinks that the films are supposed to inspire us in a particular political direction.
That's a good question. I don't know if what Bresson's idea was that the films should provoke, but to come back to this role of money, I believe that he calls it a visible God. So there he opens a kind of a tension between a visible God, which is a false God. That's why he calls it an idol. So it's like the golden calf. And then on the other hand, there is an invisible God. And he speaks, I had to cut this part, but it's from an interview from the same period where he speaks. But what's important to me is not what is visible, it's what is invisible. And the same tension appears also in interviews on these two films that he speaks about money is something material. It's people are becoming more and more materialistic. And the idea that money is perverting genuine values, which Bresson calls spiritual. So that's why I would insist on using the term transcendence, not just in the way of a transcendence as a function of consciousness, of what consciousness is, but as something Bresson believed in, actually wanted to express in these films. We talked this morning about the fact whether we should stick or believe what directors say, these authors. But I would not say that if a director says something that it is necessarily true, but it's interesting as a kind of, as an object, as a quote, as something that he said, and this is a kind of material that I like to work with. And in this respect, I would say that in these last two films, there is this tension is present. up until the level of his last film, where Bresson says in an interview, the interviewer says, but this was a very depressing film, and Bresson is surprised. He says, no, this was a very hopeful film. And this interviewer says, why? It's not possible. And then he said, yes, but you know, in the end, he testifies, and this testimony is the beginning of redemption. But unfortunately, there was the rhythm of the film, and I to keep this rhythm good, I had to cut off the last part, and that's why the film ends how it ends. But for Bresson, there was this kind of redemption. And the same is true for a film, very depressing film we talked a lot about today, Mouchette. And at the end, people also already back then in the mid-1960s said, but Bresson, it was such a terribly film of despair. Bresson said, what? Again, surprise? No, elle attend une révélation. She awaits a revelation in the end. And this also shows what kind of an orthodox, maybe even an atheist Catholic Bresson was, because of course, saying that someone who commits suicide awaits revelation, it's heretic. And that's why I believe that all the heretics from this day today can stay, because Bresson himself was an heretic. So let's
I think that's a great sentence to finish on. So I'd like to thank both our speakers and give everyone a good welcome to a great conversation.